August 23, 1939, 3:47 a.m. Bumpy Johnson's hands were steady as he pushed $127,000 across the poker table. Everything. Every dollar from Harlem's numbers operation for the entire month. The five men sitting across from him represented Dutch Schultz's old crew, the Irish mob from Hell's Kitchen, and two independent operators who controlled the Bronx. If Bumpy lost this hand, he lost Harlem. Every business, every corner, every connection he'd spent 5 years building would belong to the men who just called his bet. The dealer turned over the river card, ace of spades. Bumpy's face showed nothing, no emotion, no tell, no hint. He looked at his cards one final time, then at the five men staring back at him, waiting for him to fold. And he said 4 words that would echo through New York's underworld for the next 30 years. All in, my territory too. What nobody knew, what the newspapers never reported, is that Bumpy Johnson wasn't gambling that night. He was executing the most calculated psychological warfare operation in organized crime history, because the cards in his hand didn't matter. What mattered was making 5 desperate men believe they could take everything from him in a single night, while he systematically destroyed their ability to ever challenge him again. To understand what happened that night at the underground poker game on West 48th Street, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in August 1939. The summer of 1939 was a turning point for New York's criminal underworld. Dutch Schultz had been dead for 4 years, murdered by the Commission in 1935 for refusing to follow orders. Lucky Luciano was in prison, sentenced to 30 to 50 years on prostitution charges. The power structure that had controlled organized crime was fracturing, creating opportunities for anyone smart enough and ruthless enough to seize them. In Harlem, that person was Bumpy Johnson. At 32 years old, Bumpy had risen from being Stephanie St. Clair's enforcer to becoming the de facto boss of Harlem's most profitable operation, the numbers racket. When Queenie decided to step back from active management in 1938, she'd handed the entire operation to Bumpy. Not because he was the strongest or the most violent, but because he was the smartest. Bumpy understood something that most criminals missed. The numbers game wasn't about gambling. It was about providing hope to people who had nothing else. Poor families betting nickels and dimes on 3-digit combinations, dreaming of the one day they might hit and escape poverty. The odds were astronomical. The payouts were minimal, but the hope was real. And across Harlem, those nickels and dimes added up to $1.8 million a year. Bumpy had built a sophisticated operation. 300 runners collecting bets from every block in Harlem. 50 collectors who tallied the numbers and managed the money. 20 enforcers who protected the operation from robbery and interference. And a network of legitimate businesses, laundromats and barbershops and social clubs that served as fronts for the real work happening in back rooms. But sophistication created visibility, and visibility attracted predators. By summer 1939, 5 different criminal organizations were circling Harlem, looking for ways to take over Bumpy's operation. The remnants of Dutch Schultz's crew, now led by a man named Martin Crompier, wanted revenge for Schultz's death and believed Harlem rightfully belonged to them. The Irish mob from Hell's Kitchen, led by Mickey Spilling's predecessor Oni Madden, saw Harlem as natural expansion territory. 2 independent operators from the Bronx, brothers named Salvator and Vincent Russo, wanted to consolidate all of Upper Manhattan under their control. And shadowing all of them was the Italian Commission, watching to see who would emerge victorious so they could make their own move. Bumpy knew he couldn't fight all 5 groups simultaneously. He didn't have the manpower, the weapons, or the political connections. The Italians had judges and cops on their payroll. The Irish had union muscle. Schultz's old crew had connections to the remaining independent Jewish gangsters. What Bumpy had was Harlem itself. The community's loyalty, built through years of reinvesting money into the neighborhood instead of extracting it. But loyalty wouldn't stop bullets. It wouldn't prevent a coordinated attack. And by August 1939, Bumpy could feel the pressure building. His runners were getting jumped. His collectors were being threatened. His legitimate businesses were facing sudden code violations and health department inspections. The 5 groups weren't working together, but they were all pushing at the same time, testing for weakness. Bumpy needed to end this, not through violence, which would just create martyrs and escalate the conflict. Not through negotiation, which would show weakness and invite more demands. He needed something that would demonstrate his dominance so completely, so publicly, that no one would challenge him again. July 28, 1939, Bumpy called a meeting with his inner circle, Illinois Gordon, his strategic advisor, Junie Byatt, his head of security, Nat Pettigrew, who managed the legitimate businesses, and Queenie herself, who still provided counsel even though she'd officially retired. "We can't keep playing defense," Bumpy told them. "Every week we're responding to threats, protecting our people, putting out fires. We need to change the dynamic." "What are you thinking?" Queenie asked. She knew Bumpy well enough to recognize when he had a plan forming. "I'm thinking we use their greed against them. All 5 groups want what we have. They think if they push hard enough, we'll break, so we give them exactly what they want. We put everything on the table. Winner takes all." Illinois Gordon looked skeptical. "You want to gamble the entire operation?" "Not gamble, demonstrate. We invite all 5 groups to send representatives to a high-stakes poker game. The buy-in is everything they're willing to commit to taking Harlem, territory, money, operations, and our buy-in is Harlem itself. Winner controls everything." "That's insane," Junie said. "If we lose." "We won't lose," Bumpy interrupted, "because we're not actually gambling. We're putting them in a room together, forcing them to compete against each other instead of against us. And while they're focused on the cards, we'll be reading them, learning their tells, understanding who's desperate, who's confident, who's bluffing. We turn it into an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as a game." Queenie smiled. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking she'd taught him. "And even if you somehow lose the hand, you've accomplished something valuable. You've shown them you're willing to risk everything, which makes them respect you. And you've created a situation where the winner has to fight off the other 4 losers who'll immediately try to take what they just won." "Exactly," Bumpy said, "but we're not going to lose." Over the next 3 weeks, Bumpy's people spread the word through the underworld. Bumpy Johnson was hosting a private poker game, high stakes. Winner takes control of Harlem's numbers operation. Invitation only. The response was immediate. Martin Crompier, representing Schultz's old crew, committed $45,000 and the loyalty of 20 enforcers. Oni Madden sent word that the Irish would buy in with $38,000 and control of 3 union locals that operated in Harlem. The Russo brothers pooled $52,000 and their Bronx distribution network. 2 smaller independent operators, seeing an opportunity to leapfrog into major league status, scraped together $29,000 between them. Bumpy's buy-in was everything. The entire Harlem numbers operation. $127,000 in cash from that month's receipts, plus the infrastructure, the runners, the collectors, the protection network. Everything he'd built over 5 years. The game was set for August 23, 1939, at a neutral location. An underground club in Hell's Kitchen that Oni Madden controlled, ensuring no one could claim home field advantage. Professional dealer, independent witnesses, enforcers from each group to make sure no one tried anything during the game. 7 men would sit at that table. Bumpy, the 5 organization representatives, and 1 neutral observer who would verify the game's legitimacy. The game was Texas Hold'em. 5 cards dealt, best hand wins. No limit betting, no mercy. But Bumpy had spent those 3 weeks doing more than just promoting the game. He'd researched every single player who'd be at that table. Martin Crompier was a bully, aggressive, prone to overvaluing his hands. He'd bet big on mediocre cards just to push people around. Patrick "Paddy" Murray, representing the Irish, was cautious to a fault. He'd fold winning hands if someone bluffed confidently enough. Salvatore Russo was mathematically minded, played the odds, but had a tell. When he had a strong hand, he'd reach for his drink before betting. Vincent Russo, his brother, was emotional. He'd chase losses, bet recklessly when behind, trying to make up ground in a single hand. The 2 independent operators were wild cards, but they didn't have enough money to survive more than a few hands anyway. Bumpy had also done something else, something none of the other players knew about. He'd hired a psychology professor from Columbia University, a man named Dr. Aaron Weinstein, to teach him advanced poker theory. Not the basic odds and probabilities that any decent player knew, but the psychology of decision-making under pressure. How to read micro-expressions, how to control your own physical tells, how to create false patterns that opponents would think they'd detected, then exploit those false assumptions. For 3 weeks, Bumpy studied like he was preparing for a final exam. Because in a sense, he was. This was the final exam on everything he'd learned about power, psychology, and strategic thinking. August 23, 1939, 11 p.m., the 7 men gathered around the poker table in a private room behind the Hell's Kitchen Club. 40 witnesses in the room, enforcers and advisors from each organization. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. The dealer, a professional from Atlantic City with no allegiance to anyone, shuffled the cards. "Gentlemen, the rules are simple. Texas Hold'em, no limit. Play continues until one player has won all committed stakes or until all but one player has folded and conceded territory. The winner controls all assets on the table." He looked at each man. "This is binding. Once you sit down, you're committed, understood." Every man nodded. They dealt the first hand. Bumpy folded immediately. Weak cards, no point pretending otherwise. Martin Crompier won with a pair of jacks, took $15,000 off one of the independent operators. The second hand, Bumpy played conservatively, called to the river, then folded when Paddy Murray bet aggressively. Murray was bluffing, but Bumpy let him have the small pot. He was gathering information, not trying to win yet. Third hand, fourth hand, fifth hand. Bumpy played tight, folded often, won 2 small pots with solid cards. He was being careful, methodical, letting the other players establish patterns while he observed. By midnight, one of the independent operators was out. He'd lost everything on a foolish bluff against Salvatore Russo. That left 6 players. By 1 a.m., the second independent operator was out, beaten by Vincent Russo's lucky straight. 5 players left. Martin Crompier was up big, having won several major pots through aggressive betting. Paddy Murray was down, playing too cautiously. The Russo brothers were holding steady, and Bumpy was slightly behind, but not dangerously so. Then, at 1:47 a.m., Bumpy made his first major move. He had pocket aces, the best possible starting hand. The flop came down King of Hearts, 7 of clubs, Ace of diamonds, 3 of a kind aces, an almost unbeatable hand at this stage. Martin Crompier bet big, $22,000. He was trying to buy the pot, push everyone out. Paddy Murray folded immediately. Salvatore Russo hesitated, then called. Vincent Russo folded. Bumpy looked at his cards, looked at the pot, and raised. Plus $30,000. Crompier's eyes widened. That was a massive bet, but he'd committed to this aggressive image, and backing down now would look weak. Call. Salvatore Russo stared at the pot. $74,000 in the middle of the table, more than his entire buy-in. He folded, turn card, 3 of spades, no help to anyone. Crompier checked. Bumpy bet another $20,000. Crompier's face was red. He was pot committed now, too much money in to fold. Call. River card, Ace of spades. Bumpy now had 4 of a kind aces, literally unbeatable unless Crompier had a straight flush, which was mathematically nearly impossible. Crompier bet $15,000. Bumpy looked at him, reading every micro-expression, the slight tremor in Crompier's hand, the way he'd licked his lips before betting. The man had nothing. He was trying to bluff his way through. All in, Bumpy said. $127,000 plus my territory. The room went completely silent. Every person watching understood what had just happened. Bumpy had bet everything, not just the cash on the table, but Harlem itself. If Crompier called and won, he'd own all of it. Crompier stared at Bumpy, trying to read him. Bumpy's face showed nothing, no fear, no confidence, nothing. Crompier looked at his cards. Looked at the pot, did the math in his head. There was now over $230,000 in the middle of the table, plus control of the most profitable numbers operation in New York. But to call, he'd have to commit everything Schultz's old organization had, all of it, on one hand, against a man whose expression revealed absolutely nothing. Crompier hesitated. I fold. Bumpy didn't react. He just pulled the pot toward him. $156,000 in cash, plus he'd eliminated the most aggressive player without showing his cards. Now everyone at the table knew that Bumpy was willing to risk everything, and no one knew if he'd been holding a monster hand or running the greatest bluff in poker history. The game continued. Over the next 90 minutes, Bumpy systematically dismantled the remaining players. Paddy Murray went out at 2:34 a.m., beaten when Bumpy's full house crushed Murray's flush. Murray had played scared after watching Bumpy's all-in bet against Crompier and scared players make mistakes. Salvatore Russo lasted longer. He played smart, disciplined poker. But at 3:15 a.m., he made the mistake of reaching for his drink before making a major bet. Bumpy saw the tell, knew Russo had a strong hand, and folded what would have been a winning hand for Russo. 3 hands later, Bumpy trapped Russo with his own confidence, letting Russo bet big on what he thought was a winning hand, then revealing a straight that beat Russo's 2 pair. That left Vincent Russo, the emotional player, the one who chased losses. Bumpy had been waiting for this moment. He'd studied Vincent's pattern. When Vincent was behind, he bet recklessly. When he was ahead, he got conservative, trying to protect his lead. At 3:42 a.m., Bumpy started a campaign of small, consistent wins, nothing dramatic, just steady pressure. Within 20 minutes, Vincent was down $40,000 from his starting stack. His face was red. His breathing was heavy. He was tilting, the poker term for losing emotional control, and Bumpy knew exactly how to exploit it. At 3:47 a.m., Bumpy was dealt pocket kings. Strong hand, but not unbeatable. Flop came down, King of clubs, 8 of hearts, 2 of diamonds, 3 of a kind kings. Vincent bet $15,000, big bet, trying to take control. Bumpy raised to $30,000. Vincent hesitated, then called, turn card, Ace of spades. Vincent's eyes flicked to the ace for just a fraction of a second. A micro-expression that told Bumpy everything he needed to know. Vincent either had an ace or wanted Bumpy to think he did. Vincent bet $25,000. Bumpy raised to $50,000. Vincent called, his hand shaking slightly. River card, 9 of hearts, no help to anyone. Vincent checked. Bumpy looked at him, read the defeat in his eyes. The man was beaten and knew it. Time to finish this. All in, Bumpy said. $127,000, my territory, everything. It was the same bet he'd made against Crompier, but this time Vincent couldn't fold. He didn't have enough chips left to survive. If he folded now, Bumpy would just grind him down over the next few hands. His only chance was to call and hope. Vincent looked at his cards one final time. Call everything we have, Bronx operations, all of it. The dealer spoke. Gentlemen, show your cards. Vincent turned over his hand. Ace-jack, pair of aces, strong hand, would beat most holdings. Bumpy turned over his cards. King-king, 3-of-a-kind kings. Bumpy's hand won. The room exploded in noise. 40 people all reacting simultaneously, because what they just witnessed was impossible. Bumpy Johnson had walked into a poker game with 5 organizations trying to take everything from him, and he'd walked out having consolidated control of not just Harlem, but significant operations in the Bronx, connections to Irish unions, and claims on Schultz's old territory. He'd turned a defensive position into total victory, in a single night of poker. By sunrise on August 24, 1939, word of the poker game had spread through every criminal organization in New York. The story got bigger with each telling. Some versions had Bumpy winning with nothing but bluffs. Others claimed he'd read his opponent's minds. The truth was simpler and more impressive. Bumpy had understood that the game wasn't about cards. It was about psychology, preparation, and understanding human nature. He'd studied each opponent, learned their patterns, exploited their weaknesses, and when the moment came, he'd had the discipline and courage to risk everything on hands he knew were winners. The 5 organizations that had been circling Harlem backed off immediately. Martin Crompier left New York entirely, retiring to Miami with what little money he had left. Patty Murray reported back to Oni Madden that trying to take Harlem would be a mistake. The Russo brothers honored the poker debt, turning over their Bronx operations to Bumpy's control. Within 6 months, Bumpy had expanded his territory to cover not just Harlem, but significant portions of Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. His operation grew from $1.8 million a year to over $3.5 million. And every criminal organization in New York knew one thing with absolute certainty. You didn't gamble against Bumpy Johnson. Because when Bumpy sat down at a table, he'd already won before the cards were dealt. The poker game of August 23, 1939 taught the underworld a lesson that went far beyond gambling. It showed that power isn't always about who has the most soldiers or the biggest guns. Sometimes it's about who has the clearest understanding of human psychology and the courage to use that understanding. Bumpy Johnson proved something that night that most criminals never learn. The highest stakes gambles aren't about luck. They're about preparation. About studying your opponents until you know them better than they know themselves. About having the discipline to fold weak hands and the courage to go all in when you know you're holding the winning cards. Bumpy didn't walk into that room hoping to get lucky. He walked in knowing he'd already done the work to guarantee victory. That's not gambling. That's strategy. If this story gave you a new perspective, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you respect the grind of preparation over the illusion of luck. Let me know in the comments, would you have risked everything on a single night like Bumpy did, or played it safe? And turn on notifications because next week, we're breaking down how Bumpy Johnson survived his first stint in Alcatraz and came out with more connections than when he went in. You don't want to miss that one. Remember, in Harlem and in life, the real winners aren't the ones who get lucky. They're the ones who prepare so well that luck doesn't matter.